Now on to the headlines for today. After 408 days, there are still about 97 hostages, alive and deceased, still being held somewhere by someone in Gaza. Where and who remain uncertain, but we wish for their immediate return. According to reports, Hamas in Gaza have been incommunicado for fear of intelligence failures, and interestingly, has also started recruitment efforts. In short, a deal does not seem imminent. Hamas officials, however, were in fact booted from Qatar. And where did they go? Turkey. After severing all ties with Israel and calling for an arms embargo against Israel, along with Russia and China, Erdogan's welcoming of Hamas may have put the nail in the Israel-Turkey relationship. It'll be interesting to see how Europe and the US deal with Erdogan's unrelenting march with the axis of authoritarians. In the category of good news, Iran has reportedly given support for a Lebanon-Israel deal. More time is needed to iron out those details, but it's a message the regime may view itself as vulnerable and is looking to protect its position. It's something we discussed last week with Ilan Berman. And in Europe, Germany and the Netherlands have been actively working to suppress anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. Germany's Bundestag overwhelmingly passed, and overwhelmingly means 93% of the Bundestag, legislation that would end public funding for organizations that engage in anti-Semitism and promote the boycott of Israel. And in the Netherlands, senior members of the ruling Dutch coalition during parliamentary debate last week spoke in favor of stripping anti-Semitic and violent dual nationals of their Dutch citizenship. This too will be interesting to see how other European countries try to deal with the problem that they are handling or they are dealing with in their own countries. It's often stated that Israel is fighting a seven-front war. Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, Palestinian militants in the West Bank, and of course, Iran. But there is an eighth front, PR and the media, which affect global opinions of Israel. Well, the good news here is that ELNET works to broaden and deepen diplomatic, military, defense, intelligence, and economic cooperation and relationships between Israel and European countries. So regardless of the front or how many fronts there are, these burgeoning relationships between Israel and Europe are fortifying Israel's security and global standing in the world. Conversely, Europe too is benefiting beyond imagination by this relationship or by their relationships with Israel. Okay, on to today's discussion, which I promise will be interesting. And it's a bit off the beaten path for us, but it's a path that seems to have received scant attention over the past year. The anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests that shook US campuses last school year and took over streets and bridges in US cities and European cities all seemed highly coordinated and very well funded. Protests were already prepared to take to the streets on October 8th. College campus encampments all had the same tents. None lacked food or keffiyehs for that matter. It's not easy to coordinate 250,000 protesters, but that's exactly what we saw in the streets of London. Who's behind these protests? What are their agendas? What do policymakers need to know to do a better job of protecting their city's Jews, Israelis, and the broader civilian population? To answer these questions and more, I am proud to and pleased to introduce Ryan Mauro. Ryan is an investigative researcher focused on US-based extremist groups and foreign influence operations for Capital Research Center. Capital Research Center is an investigative think tank that examines how foundations, charities, and other nonprofits spend money and get involved in politics and advocacy, often in ways that their donors never intended and would find abhorrent. Ryan is a prominent foreign affairs, counter-extremism, and national security analyst with over 2,000 media appearances. He was previously the director of intelligence for a group that infiltrated terrorist networks and prevented acts of violence and criminality by extremists of all kinds: Islamists, anti-police militants, anarchists and communists, white nationalists, and anti-government, anti-immigrant, anti-minority, and anti-Muslim militants. Ryan has a bachelor's in intelligence studies, a master's in political science, and a graduate certificate in Middle East studies from American Military University. And as an example of taking things a bit too far, He has a certificate from an online extremist school just so he could learn the ideology of Islamist terrorism directly. So Ryan, I'd like to welcome you. It's great to have you here tonight. Today.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So the first question is, in doing some of my research, from what I can tell, you spent your career, which started at 16, researching extremists. So the obvious question is, why and how does a 16-year-old get involved in this topic and make it his career?
I can't really explain it. My family does not have a background in this topic, so it just caught my interest at a young age before 16, and I just kind of got obsessively into it, and that became my hobby. And yeah, just a series of chance meetings after getting published in a few different places around that age, resulted in me getting hired for a maritime-related intelligence type security company. And that's in 2002. That's when I was 16. And then that just led from going from one place to the next until I ended up here.
So you do research for Capital Research Center. You also do things on your own. So how does that Venn diagram actually work? What is it that you perhaps do on your own that may be different from Capital Research, and where is the shaded area between the two?
Sure. So Capital Research Center focuses on publicly available information to primarily focus on the funding streams between different politically involved nonprofit organizations. On the side, what I'll do, and they sometimes overlap a little bit, is more focus on individual extremists and criminal activity and getting that information into the hands of law enforcement, so that hopefully something can be done, whether that's an arrest or there's a range of different things that can happen from that point. But then they intersect because you'll see a lot of these more militant and criminal-oriented extremists in the same ecosystem as these nonprofits. And so they kind of end up fueling each other, but more so the nonprofits that will be, say they're radical on the 1 to 10 scale, say they're a 7, they'll fuel those that become a 9 or a 10. They set the foundation for that to happen.
Interesting. So I've heard your name for a long period of time because I've followed this subject as well for a long period of time. But you really had my attention more recently when I saw the video that you had put out there with Capital Research, and it was called Marching Towards Violence. And it was a very disturbing video. In that you identify 150 U.S. groups behind anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and these anti-Israel protests. For those on the call who remember the Holy Land Foundation back in the I think it was the 90s, this may sound somewhat reminiscent of that, where there were 50 U.S. Islamist organizations. Could you go into the 150 organizations and what may be similar or dissimilar to what we saw in the 90s?
What has changed from the 90s is that you had more fixed targets. The internet and the social media ecosystems weren't as much of a thing, or for some of the 90s, even a thing at all. And so you could kind of focus in on a group like Holy Land Foundation or the central nodes, and say, okay, well, this is the terrorist infrastructure. They came over, they had to set up an entity. Here's the individuals. Now it's become more vague. And that's because you can have a group of people that just set up an Instagram page that's very popular, and they operate in all sorts of ways as an organization. They just aren't officially an organization. And then there's all sorts of ways to hide funding and also to operate as a nonprofit, even get tax-deductible donations without having your own registered nonprofit, and therefore having zero transparency behind your funding, your leadership structure, really anything. And so the problem's gotten dramatically worse in terms of size, intensity, and complexity, because it's just gotten easier for the bad guys to operate. But the report that I came out with, Marching Towards Violence, basically began because just like everyone else who knows about this topic, we assume when there's these big protests, regardless of what issue it is, you have certain extremist groups that come in and exploit that. It can be issues related to police brutality. It can be related to immigration, whatever. You always have some bad guys that come in, and very often they cause trouble. And so we saw that happening with the anti-Israel protests, but I wanted to see, well, what is the proportion here? Because everyone was saying, and frankly, I agreed with them originally, that the vast majority of the protesters were not extremists. The groups involved were not extremists, but you had some big players that were bad involved, and they were responsible for the trouble. And what I found was that even by my own bleak, pessimistic um, view on some of these trends before I did the report, is that it was even worse than I imagined by a long shot. And I started tallying up the different groups that were on the flyers, that were organizing things, and I found over 150 pro-terrorism, I mean, explicitly pro-Hamas, pro-October 7th type groups driving the protests. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the groups involved are pro-terrorism, and some even connected to foreign governments, whether it's the Chinese government or the Iranians, and various others. There's some groups that even support the North Korean government, which I was a bit amazed to see that even exists. So what I saw was that there is this big infrastructure driving these protests, and it was very much manufactured. And when I was looking at the trends of what they were talking about in their private and semi-private communications on their social media pages, and then also chats that I would get into among their members, is that they are, as the title suggests, marching towards violence. They on American soil. They believe that the vast majority of these groups believe that the U.S. should be abolished, that the U.S. is equally illegitimate as Israel. We are created by colonial borders. We are occupying Native American land, which they'll refer to as Turtle Island. That's a terminology that I recommend everyone memorize, because that's the real tell there. When they start saying, oh, we're protesting in Turtle Island, that's like saying you're in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv and calling it Palestine.
And
You're
what's the meaning of
that type
Turtle
of
Island?
I'm sorry?
What's the meaning of Turtle Island? Why is
Oh,
that a key phrase?
so it comes from this myth that that's what all the Native American or most of the Native American tribes collectively refer to North America as. So to them, that's
Interesting.
equivalent to
Wow.
Palestine. Yeah.
So I think there are probably a number of people on this call who can readily identify a number of organizations that would be on that list. Are there some that we should be aware of that we may not be aware of, that we may not know, that are helping to really guide this consortium of 150 organizations?
Well, obviously, with the excellent work that you guys do, you're going to know the major players. I mean, ELNET is going to know that. But there are many other groups that, I mean, there's just so many. My private list is at, I think I've got like 3,500 different entities
Oh.
of various kinds involved in anti-Israel type protests, but borderline pro-terrorism and explicitly pro-terrorism. So these new entities are constantly popping up if you include individual chapters and new social media type groups that are popping up, which again, some people say you shouldn't count them as organizations, but I see no meaningful difference beyond semantics. The one group in the United States that everyone talks about, but there's an important point being missed, or a couple points being missed, is Students for Justice in Palestine. Everybody, everyone involved in this issue knows about them. We all know that they're pro-Hamas. What very few people seem to realize, and I think it's because we were so shocked by how pro October 7th they were when the attacks happened, that we missed some of the other incriminating stuff that they said, which is that they explicitly said in their toolkit, which is like a guide of resources that they give to protesters on how to answer questions and websites to go to learn more. They said, we are not in support of, referring to Hamas. They said the resistance group that carried out the attacks, it's Hamas. They said, we're not in support of them. We are them. We're part of them. I mean, that's a very important distinction. So it's not just that we agree. We are actually part of a designated foreign terrorist organization that, although it's legal to be supporters of them in the United States, it is not legal to materially support them, meaning doing recruitment on their behalf, spreading their propaganda. That all qualifies as material support. I suppose you could say arguably, but I think it's a very strong, very, very strong argument. because you look at how ISIS has and Al Qaeda members have been gone after by law enforcement, and the media and everyone will refer to them as members of ISIS and Al Qaeda. Why? Because they swore allegiance. They said they're part of the group. Now you can have groups like Students for Justice in Palestine doing the same thing with Hamas, and somehow it's treated differently. Like, oh yeah, they're saying they're part of Hamas, but are they really Hamas? No, with these groups, if you swear allegiance and say you're part of them and that you're operating at their direction and control, you're part of them. And that's an important argument to make and to emphasize, particularly when you're engaging with those that can influence college officials, because they can hide behind these arguments of, all right, well, it's First Amendment, protect free speech. But when you can shift that to say, well, it's illegal for a designated foreign terrorist organization to materially operate in the United States, why can they materially operate on your college campus? It changes things a little bit. The First Amendment argument there isn't going to work. There's no good answer to that. The only good answer is, oh, I didn't know that, and so we're going to do something now. It really boxes them in. Again, the Turtle Island reference, the same statement that came out after October 7th was referring to the United States, not as the United States, Turtle Island. I mean, that's an endorsement of the destruction of the United States. And it's kind of an indirect legitimization of violence on American soil, because it's saying that the same justification that is legitimate for that legitimizes violence in Israel also applies to the United States. They just know not to use those words, at least not yet. But anyone that understands the ideology, that specific audience knows what that means.
I do remember a number of months ago, many months ago, actually, members of Congress trying to make that argument that they have, in essence, pledged their allegiance to Hamas. But I don't recall that really garnered much momentum. Seemed to have fallen flat. And we'll get to what your recommendations are for policies, for policymakers, and even for individuals like us. The one thing I'd like to transition a little bit, because before we get to some of the conclusions and revelations of your work, I want to talk about your methodology, because you started going down the path of social media. You talked about the difference between the 90s and now and the availability of information. How do you go about researching 3,500 organizations? Is this all open source, or do you also have people within the organizations that perhaps are willing to talk to you? To what extent is your ability to research these organizations?
So there are informants and sources inside groups that knowingly talk to me, and those that don't realize they're talking to me. And as I've done over throughout my career, so that's not really a new thing. And so yes, that does give me some insight, but honestly, they're not saying anything that I've come across privately that is too much more extreme than what they say publicly. I mean, it's what you would imagine. It's a bit more explicit and direct, a little bit more detailed. But there isn't much of a gap there. But in terms of the methodology for the specific report, the Marching Towards Violence report, basically all I did was I looked at which groups were endorsing the protest, because when they put out an advertisement, they usually have the group's logos on there. And groups that apply for permits, and they go through any type of process like that, they attach the name of a group. And so I was just collecting them. And it quickly spiraled out of control as I was trying to research as many of them as possible. And so I just looked at which ones were most frequently popping up, which ones seemed to be the most involved in fundraising, arranging transportation, and PR, social media mobilization. And that's how I came up with that list of over 150 pro-terrorism groups. And really, the ones that were left off of that list, many of those, you can make a strong argument, are also pro-terrorism, but I wanted to take the most conservative, high threshold approach towards this and say only if they explicitly support Hamas and terrorism do I want to include them on this list, because I don't want to get distracted by arguments about, oh, are you missing nuance or anything like that. So the real number is actually much higher. And if you look at any protest that involves a number of groups, it's really not common that you find any that explicitly support a permanent two-state solution. A two-state solution temporarily so they can destroy Israel. Yeah, you'll sometimes find that. But you'll rarely find ones that actually say, yeah, we want a permanent two-state solution, and we oppose terrorism and killing people to get there. Very few involved in these protests believe in that.
Is there a way to categorize these groups? And I imagine not all, 150 are the same. You referenced earlier, I think, or actually I did in your bio, how many different groups there are. So where's the, if you could categorize the groups or the category, yeah, categorize the groups that you've come across and help us understand what their differences are and perhaps why they align.
Sure. So there's a couple ways you can do it. On the one hand, you can do it ideologically because the vast majority of these self-identify as Marxist, communist, anarchist, or Islamist, or they make it clearly through the symbols they use and things. It's not hidden. And then you have a significant minority that don't do that, but then adopt the language. But most of them are quite open that those are their ideology. So you can categorize them that way. But in the Marching Towards Violence report, the way I chose to organize them was to kind of show the factory behind all of this. I want to show the terrorism factory within the United States and categorize it that way. And so what I came up with was that there are four overlapping circles. The broadest circle is the political warfare circle. And those are the ones that have the most political capital. They're viewed with the most legitimacy. You have groups like Muslim American Society, which was, according to federal prosecutors, founded as the overt arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And these groups are more tame because they don't want to lose their political capital, their access, things like that. But they fan the flames. They know how far that they can go. And the genius of their success, and part of the reason that this overall pro-terrorism movement has been so successful this time around, is because the way they structured their protest and their campaign was not issue-based, really. I mean, they're talking about an issue, but that's not how they approach the campaign. So like if we want to launch a pro-Israel campaign or there's a pro-Second Amendment type campaign, what do? You contact the other pro-Israel, pro-Second Amendment, pro-life, pro-choice, whatever. You get all those groups together, and then you pursue that issue. That's usually how people do it. This is different. They approach this more like a political party does, where there's all these different social justice planks in this case, and they bring them together. And they would find by extreme stretches of logic ways to approach the LGBT groups that they're a part of, the pro-choice groups, the groups that are fighting against homelessness. Every group that fits under that social justice category, they try to unite them just like a political party tries to unite the different factions of their base. And so that's why they're really successful. So that's the outermost circle, the political warfare circle. That is the most tame, but they indirectly support a lot of this. You just have to know how they're talking and catch the nuance. The second circle within there would be the supporters of the destructive property destruction, criminal protests, that type of thing. What they do is they'll demonize the police. The second that they show up, they make it sound as if this is a civil rights protest from the 60s and the cops are coming in brutalizing these civil rights activists. These groups will act as fiscal sponsors for other extreme groups, which means that they basically loan their nonprofit status so that they can fundraise. One of the tricks that they use is that this circle will distribute activism guides, toolkits, like I mentioned before, and you'll look at them and you'll say, it's not, it's not that extreme. Certainly anti-Israel, but no smoking gun there. But then you'll look, particularly towards the end of it, they'll say, for more information on how to organize a protest or how to do X, Y, Z, go to these websites, and they'll link to, in most cases, what seems like an innocuous webpage. But it'll be hosted on a website that is militant anarchist. So what they're doing is they direct their audience to web pages that once they go there, yeah, you're reading an article just about how to avoid detection by police, how to hold a protest, but they'll see in the sidebar that the website they're on, those are the instructions on how to light things on fire. That's how to fight police, how to do all of these things. That's purposeful. I mean, it's the equivalent of like imagine if a professor had at a community college brought in students and said, okay, I'm teaching you how to be an electrician. So for your first project, I'm going to teach you how to build a bomb. Like, you don't have to like it's not necessary that you have to go in this direction and choose militant anarchist websites for this information that you can get from other sources. That's done on purpose. So those would be the supporters. The circle within there, the third circle, are the insiders, the people that are saying escalate for Gaza. We're not just supporting what's going on, we're trying to make it worse. And they'll do things like a Students for Justice in Palestine group held a dealing with cops workshop, and also held like a, what they call a self-defense seminar. But that was done right before they're expecting the police to come in. And at the same time telling people to escalate. You have groups like the Chinese Communist Party Front, People's Forum, telling its audience to go to these protests and, without using the word defend, they'll say, protect the students, make sure that they can stand up for their rights because the cops are coming in to try to take it away. And you read that, you know what they're saying. They're saying go and fight. And then you have the innermost circle, the worst circle, the domestic terrorism circle, that is not just saying to expand what they're doing where they're located, but expand the campaign overall. Have a violent insurgency nationwide, expand your target list, and their mantra is that the time for discussion has been had. This issue has received as much attention as it's going to. People who can be educated are educated now. They have made their choice. So the time for dialogue is over. It is now time to impose our will, not persuade, because we've already had that. Everyone who could be persuaded is already persuaded. So now you need to go and you need to harass people, destroy property, light things on fire, kill people, hurt people, do all sorts of things that qualify as domestic terrorism. But because it's not 9/11 level, and it's not car bombs going off yet, it's not referred to as acts of terrorism, but by any legal or logical definition, they qualify as acts of terrorism. And their big strategic shift right now is to adopt the anti-police cause. I mean, they'll say it's anti-police brutality, it's anti-racism and things like that. But if you look at the rhetoric, I mean, it's fundamentally anti-police. They want to dismantle law enforcement. And what they are saying, and I quote this in the report repeatedly, is that Middle Eastern issues come and go. And that's a problem for this movement. So what they need to do in order to make an insurgency, because an insurgency can't really take breaks if it wants to be successful, is they need to merge with the anti-police movement, because that issue is always around. And then from there, you can have this anti-government insurgency, or multiple insurgencies, go on to fight law enforcement, obviously fight the Jews, anything that they consider to be Zionist. And so that's kind of the agenda of the fourth circle that's pulling in the third, second, and first circles towards its orbit.
So if I understand correctly, this is the ultimate in intersectionality, whereas Israel is not per se their primary focus right now. It happens to be the cause du jour right now that is unifying all of these organizations at the moment. But because of their relationships now, once this is over, and we hope it's over soon, they'll move on to something like police brutality, but we'll see very similar responses. Is that what you're saying?
Right. You'll see these same pro-Hamas groups being just as involved in those types of protests, doing the same exact things, and they're just going to be shifting the reason.
And I think we could probably argue that was what was taking place back in 2020 in this country. They were really starting to create their relationships, and it was almost proof of concept in a way, I imagine.
Yeah, they'll say that too. I mean, they refer to that as a time of success, and they'll refer to how they built those relationships. Now it's a lot more solidified, and there'll be some arguments between the anarchists and the communists and the Islamists, but it's surprisingly not heated. They're much more solidified. They're much more coordinated now. Whereas before it was kind of like you had to pull together all of these bad guys together and get them in the same room, and it was almost like trying to organize a party with a bunch of your friends with hectic schedules. It's like, all right, well, you got to pull this work, and now it's like you just hit a button, and they all operate as one octopus.
Let's talk about a trend that I think you mentioned to me you were seeing, and that is the attractiveness of these groups, this consortium, to young people. Why is it attracting young people? And I assume this is not just in the United States, it's in Europe too. It's in all Western societies.
Sure. So one of the things I've done, especially over the past year, is I try not to focus just on when I'm analyzing these people. I want to feel as if I know them like they're a close friend, and really try to understand them. And so I'll look at the communications they're having with their friends and family and colleagues that's not political, because we're focused just on the political stuff, but that's not the entirety of most human beings. Even the radicals, they have lives beside that then influence their political activity. And so, yes, it's true that a lot of these groups are reaching to you simply because they have a lot of points of contact. Because of biases on the college campuses that have been long documented. They're going after the youth at younger and younger ages because Generation Z really is the activism generation. I mean, middle schoolers are now political activists. And I'm only seeing these type of extremist groups forming middle school and high school chapters now. Democratic Socialists for America being one of them. That's a pro-Hamas group. So they organizationally they have a leg up, but culturally something is happening, or has happened, and we're just waking up to it now. Which is fundamentally that the idea that all you have to do is work hard and you'll make it is considered to be widely discredited. I mean, you'll hear that rhetoric, Republican clubs and stuff, on college campuses. But you won't hear that just pull yourself up by the bootstraps type rhetoric and faith in capitalism and Western society broadly. And that's the starting point. That's not the result of them becoming Marxist or whatever first and then having that viewpoint. It's the other way around. And the vast majority of the hardcore activists, you'll see in their conversations having with their friends, they refer to moments of tragedy that happened to their family where, frankly, somebody, a charity, a church, a synagogue, somebody should have stepped in and helped them and did not. And their lives were affected in horrific ways, or still are being affected. And if you look at how difficult it is to buy a home and things like that, these students are terrified about how to make ends meet in a way that doesn't leave them completely miserable and working 24/7 after college. And that's the starting point. And these groups that are radical are the only ones whose rhetoric is far sweeping and emotionally powerful enough for these students to identify with. Because if you're out there arguing, well, we need to increase taxes or decrease this and tax credits, and they're hearing that's just the same old stuff and it's too incremental, it's too small. The threat to my livelihood and my future is too high for these little measures. But so then the groups that come in and start talking about revolution and uprising and widespread change, that's what they gravitate towards, even if in their mind they're not thinking of, oh, Marxist revolution or even violence or anything like that. But that's the starting point. They get brought into the ecosystem, and that's the point at which the ideologies start being adopted either in whole or in part. It's not like they buy all the anarchist, Marxist, communist, and conservative, Republican, and libertarian and liberal books and then make a decision. With this group, with this constituency, it just doesn't work like that. And so any type of counter messaging on a broad level beyond just, the pro-Israel, anti-Israel arguments, I think a lot of those arguments are actually missing the point, because they're identifying with Palestinians and any type of what they see as a radical minority, because they're saying, oh, they're feeling like how I'm feeling.
I'm scary. I'd like to turn it a little bit to Europe as an organization that works across Europe. I think that's important for our viewers. Can you talk a little bit about I know it's not your area of focus, but I think you understand a lot of the organizations and perhaps where the breadth of these organizations takes them. What's similar and dissimilar between what the United States is dealing with and Europe? In Europe, as we all know, their Muslim population is a greater percentage of their populations than the Muslim population is here. They, however, have certainly a large population of anarchists, global anarchists, far-right extremists. So again, back to that Venn diagram, what is Europe dealing with, perhaps in ways that we're not, and what do we share together?
I mean, Europe's problem is bigger because of the demographics issue that you mentioned. There's just a bigger pool from which to recruit from. But one of the things that's similar between the US and Europe that I've seen over the past year is that the Islamist militants seem to have almost taken a step back and allowed Marxist and anarchist types to be at the front. A very wise strategic decision. And I feel like you guys would know, I mean, you guys would know better than I do. But when I'm looking at a lot of the reports of the fighting with police and the rioting and the pictures of that, anecdotally, it looks as if the same phenomenon is happening in Europe. When I look at the overall threat picture, and I include in the Marching Towards Violence report, not just the ideologies I mentioned, the Islamists, the anarchists, the communists, but also the white nationalists. And just based on the ecosystems that are international, I may be focusing on US ones, but the European components come in, because on Telegram, I mean, there are no borders. The white nationalist element seems to be much stronger in Europe than it is in the United States, much, much stronger. Much more openly pro-Russia, pro-Putin. And so I would say it's a little bit different there in terms of proportionality, but Europe's problem is, I would say, quantitatively a lot worse. In terms of quality, it seems very similar. Everything else seems very similar. But Europe, the problem is worse, and I would say white nationalists seem to be taking up a larger portion of that overall radical pie. But one of the things I mentioned to you also was that as I was getting involved in all these Telegram chats, and I just decided for a while to just get in as many as possible so I could see, in terms of the numbers, what it looks like. Instead of just focusing on the ones that are the most popular, let's look at it. And I ended up getting into over 700 extremist Telegram chats. And the vast majority were spreading Russian language content that Telegram translates, like not even hiding it. Or was coming from Russian posters, or like the creators of the post, authors of posts, I mean, were Russian or coming from explicitly Russian or pro-Putin Telegram channels. Like it really wasn't hidden. And so I was kind of shocked by that because I was expecting there to be more Chinese Communist Party. The overall, I mean, I know Russia and Putin were involved in this type of stuff, but at least when it came to Telegram, the overwhelming amount of content that's going around these ecosystems that traces back to Russian origin was really jaw-dropping to me.
Okay. Some of these things are kind of hard to get your arms around. First is that you actually engaged in 700 chats with extremist-minded people. I guess on a personal note, how do you maintain yourself in that regard? You're getting in cesspools and some of the kind of the worst ideas out there, and somehow you manage to maintain this wall between you and those ideas. Not that I expect you to fall prey to those ideas, but it has to have some effect on you.
Yeah, it does, and you have to be aware of it. Because I've seen loyal people in the US military fall to white nationalist propaganda because they got involved in some Reddit ecosystems. And I'm talking about smart, like really smart people that I know of that fell into this. And so everyone that thinks that they're not susceptible to it, you're the most susceptible. Every human being is susceptible to this stuff. So it's really just being on guard and also making sure that you expose yourself to stuff from the other side, having a healthy news diet, and being very, very disciplined about it. But without going off on a tangent, I think that's like one of the core problems in US and Western society right now is people not even thinking of having a healthy news diet about what they put in their mind, in addition to food and what they put in their body. Because what you expose yourself to is going to influence you, even if you think, oh, I'm so smart, I can get through it. We have less control over our own mental health and thinking process than we think, is my assessment. But so you've got to make sure that you have stuff to counter it, and then you have to have a lot of content that's not related to it at all, so that you're not too absorbed in it too. And you have to be very disciplined. Luckily, I've seen enough people lose their minds that I've been able to learn from their experiences. So I have a benefit of being, I guess, a little bit younger and having older friends and older colleagues that have dealt with this. But how it has influenced my views, I would say the more I learn about them, the more nuance I capture. Even though their solutions and their ideologies are pretty simplistic, rhetoric is very simplistic. They do have prolonged conversations where they discuss different nuances and, well, how does our ideology and what we believe apply here? There appears to be a contradiction. And so I get a good grasp for the thinking process, areas of vulnerability that they may not publicly express. Um, I don't know if empathy is the right word. I have a much better understanding. I guess it would be empathy, of why
Mhm.
students get drawn to these groups. When I see that, when they're not talking about hating Israel and all of that, when I see the majority of the time is talking about the tragedies that they're going through, and sharing content about, oh, the latest study showing you have to make like 107,000 to afford a home now on average in America. Um, and they're constantly, and almost every day there's some report like that they're all sharing amongst each other. I see that there is a substantive element. Not all of them are still, plenty of them are dumb and ignorant and all of that and immature and all that. It plays a role. But there is a substantive level there. There is a logic there. And I think I have a better, like I said, empathy for what they're going through and how they get to where they get to, aside from just dismissively saying, oh, well, they're extremists, they're bad people, they're stupid, whatever.
Mhm.
So that's how it's affected me.
Before I get to my next question, pardon me, want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please submit it to ELNET Q&A. We'd love to hear your thoughts or questions on this. So, Ryan, you made a couple of, I think, very important points just to reemphasize. I mean, one is you paraphrase John Stuart Mill. If all you know is your opinion, you don't know that very well. And so the idea is you really must be diligent in trying to capture as much information as you can from all the different sources so you can get a better understanding of how to think yourself. And if you're captured by one political agenda, you won't understand that fully until you understand the entire rainbow of ideas out there. So that's really powerful. Thank you. Um, let's talk about some of the policy recommendations you have. And given that the United States and Europe are dealing with different demographics, I imagine that the policy recommendations would be different. So, what are some of the policy? And we do have members of parliament on this call and other political influencers. So, any policies you have that you think policy influencers should understand, please. I'd like to hear them.
Sure. They're largely US centric, but I know that they're applicable in Europe because the laws are different. You guys can actually, there's a lot more that you can do than can be done in the United States. So it certainly is applicable. But there's an interesting contrast between what the trends tell you and what my assessment says is like a lot of their goals are achievable. We think they're not, but they are. The idea of capturing the American electorate by having enough swing voters on their side, having a nationwide uprising, guerrilla warfare, by exploiting partisan divisions, racial divisions, and things like that. They're not crazy for thinking they could succeed. And in fact, I would say the trend is in their favor in that regard. But the contrast with that, and this is to set the background for how important these recommendations are. Again, you can find them in the Marching Towards Violence report that we put out, is that as bad of a threat as it is, and as bleak of a picture as those trends indicate the future looks like, this is very easily defeatable. Like we could roll this back very rapidly, easily, without a ton of investment. That's perhaps the most frustrating thing about all of this. The number one recommendation I would have, again, a little bit US centric, but it applies to Europe, is the fact that it is against the IRS code for your nonprofit to, as an organization, plot to break the law, even if it's a local ordinance. I used to think because this is so not enforced that I assumed there was a loophole where, oh, you basically all that could happen to you was being prosecuted as an individual, but if your organization as a whole is egging it on, that's fine. Nope. IRS code says explicitly and it uses the example of like a radical anti-military, anti-war, nuclear disarmament type group is out there saying we're going to break local ordinances and break laws. We're going to interfere with traffic and things like that. You do not qualify for that status. So you'll need legislation. You'll need that. All you need are people that know that that's there and want to do something about it in the IRS and strip away their nonprofit status. I mean, it's easy to do, and it's like the amount of destruction that would do to the movement is incalculable. There'd be a clear day before and day after. It'd be worse for the movement in the United States than the beeper operation was to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Like, I mean, it really would cut them off at the knees. That's one recommendation. Designating foreign entities as foreign terrorist organizations, or especially designated terrorists or criminal entities, as the U.S. Treasury Department and State Department is able to do, and has actually begun doing. To its credit, the Biden administration designated Samadoun, a Front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, in Canada as a foreign terrorist entity, which was amazing to see. And so that type of thing can be done on a broader scale. There's all sorts of broader foreign policy recommendations in terms of activism. One of the best things that people can do is approach the college. More and more schools are suspending these student groups for breaking the law, for engaging in threats, engaging in racist, anti-Semitic type hate behavior. But they're suspended, usually not completely dissolved. DeSantis in Florida dissolved a couple of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters. But so this is working on its own without our side really using everything that we're equipped with. And like I said before, the SJP saying that they are Hamas is messaging that actually has not been deployed. Their pro-Hamas has been, but the fact that they say they are Hamas, I have actually not seen any school officials cornered on that and being forced to answer to that issue. Educating reporters is a big one, really big one. That's easy. I read literally, I think literally 99% of mainstream media news articles about the protests over the past year. And I can remember 3 that actually mentioned these groups and said, oh, by the way, they're tied to or support Hamas. Very often they won't even name the groups that are involved in the protests. And they'll sometimes quote the leaders as local activists, local protest leaders, something like that. And then those that do mention the names of the groups don't give any context. So they just sound like civil rights activists. And so readers would see that and say, oh, well, this is, so-and-so for human rights. I mean, they're being quoted by the newspaper. They're putting on protests. They must have credibility. They must be at least partly true. And look, they just quoted another 5 organizations. And the newspaper won't point out that it's like the same leader running all of them, or they have a common donor, and especially won't mention that they're pro-Hamas or pro-terrorism, which is a very relevant fact for readers to know. And in my experience, the reason that does not appear is, yeah, there's some bias, but reporters are massively, massively underpaid and overworked. I mean, to a breaking point. So they have to put out a quick article and move on to the next thing, going a step deeper and saying, all right, well, the issue of whether they support terrorism or not is not the headline here. The headline is just a protest, and I'm just quoting what they're saying. And so most of them won't even know that that's the case or even think to include it. So kindly approaching them and just sending them like an influence watch. That's part of Capital Research Center's influence watch. A profile showing how these groups are extreme, or sending my report with a copy and paste the excerpt, very short email, 1 or 2 sentences or paragraphs, I mean, and say, just so you know, that group that you quote on, like, they support Hamas. You might want to in the future tell your readers that. I believe, in fact, I know, would make a huge impact. And if they don't do it, then you shame them on social media and you tag them and say, how come you didn't mention that this group supports Hamas in your news report? Because reporters are sensitive to that. So it's because perceived objectivity is everything to their career. So there's an unlimited number of inexpensive or non-financial things that people can do in order to make a really huge difference. And everything that we're dealing with right now is not something that we should be dealing with or that we have to deal with or put up with. Again, this is the consequences could be higher, but it couldn't be easier to defeat at the same time.
Right. And I mean, the point there is knowledge is power, and political influencers want knowledge. And I think if you come across as well-spoken, understand the issues, start a conversation, you're highly likely to be at least heard. And that's some good advice there, both with politicians as well as journalists. So we've got a few questions, but before that, I'd like to say a word on behalf of ELNET, and it's going to be very brief because you have seen enough of me today. One of my favorite Latin phrases is res ipsa loquitur. It speaks for itself. You are on this call, you have seen, you have heard, you have witnessed all the work that ELNET does. There is so much more for this organization to do in order to continue broadening and deepening relationships between Israel and Europe. Our goal next year is to increase the number of delegates and increase the number of delegations. And as we've said in prior calls, the cost to send a delegate to or from Israel is roughly $5,000. So in order for us to increase the number of delegates and increase the number of delegations, your support will be helpful in achieving those goals. And certainly for those you know who would care about this issue, introducing them to our organization. So with that, again, as always, I want to thank you for joining us today. Let's open it up to some questions. The first one I was asked to ask on his behalf, Adam Goodvach, or Goodvach, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Ryan, did you come across any Jewish organizations in your 150 group list?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think. The absolute worst one would be like International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. There's some that are explicitly, anti-Israel that way. The big one, though, and they are hugely powerful in this movement, is Jewish Voice for Peace. And they contradict themselves where they will say belatedly and softly, oh, we condemn the October 7th attacks, but that historically other acts of terrorism they've supported, individual chapters explicitly pro-Hamas, the national branch doesn't do anything about it or distance themselves from it. At first I actually thought they would not make the list. I thought that they would just be, demonizing Israel, maybe, giving a little legitimacy to attacks. I didn't realize it until I looked at the overall history of Jewish Voice for Peace, the stuff that they have said, what the leadership had said, what the chapters are saying, to realize, no, they fit squarely right in there. There's like one or two quotes out there where they made it sound like that they condemn terrorism and are not on the side of Hamas, but there's more statements where they are on the side of Hamas and in support of terrorism. And I was not able to, usually I try to find consistency, and sometimes difficult, but usually you can find some consistency, even if it's convoluted. With Jewish Voice for Peace, I could not find that consistency. They have to be, unless they're rapidly changing their mind, like they're multipolar, not even bipolar, multipolar, in mentally, or they're just lying. I lean in favor that they're actually just making the decision to lie at times, because they've done things that are just, they can't argue or downplay as being not pro-terrorism. So then when they come out and then they say something that sounds anti-terrorism, that contradicts that, and then they go back to the original position, that tells me that that moment of, I guess, weakness, you could say, where they said what they had to because they were back into a corner, that was a lie. And you look at the groups that they associate with, saying the worst things, explicitly supporting October 7th, and then Jewish Voice for Peace holds rallies with them, and has speakers and does all this stuff with them. You can't claim to be anti-terrorism and do things like that. If you're anti-terrorism, you're not going to want to be friends with people that want to massacre Jews around the world.
Yeah, those of us on this side of the line have long known that JVP is neither Jewish nor peaceful.
Yeah.
Though their name may suggest it. Do you come across If Not Now?
I have. I believe they did not make the list because I made such a high threshold and I couldn't quite find the smoking gun. If I remember right, I think shortly after October 7th, they put out a tweet or something criticizing the attacks. I would double check on that, but I think that's what I found. And so I had to contrast that with their other statements that are kind of like, giving legitimacy to violence. But I wanted to make this so inarguable that I made the strategic decision to just, let's put them off to the side for this one report.
I want to square the circle, which is kind of the conversation we've had and the title of the talk today, which was Globalize the Intifada, because I want to understand that concept within the context of what we've been discussing. Is Globalize the Intifada a way of recognizing a a category within the four circles, or is it a rallying title for the entire? I'm trying to use the
No,
right.
I know what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah.
What does it
Okay.
mean to them when they say it, basically?
Right. All right. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I haven't had anyone ask me that before. Because it is one that I sometimes struggle with when groups say it, like, what do they actually mean? I mean, the majority of the cases, these are pro-terrorism groups saying it, so you know that they are saying, engage in terrorism. When they say globalize the intifada, these same groups will be the ones that are saying attack globally, Zionist targets, capitalist targets. Very often they'll broaden it out, police targets, and so globalize the intifada to someone who isn't following these groups and has that natural impulse to want to believe the best, kindest interpretation of horrible rhetoric. They'll say, all right, well, I think they're just saying people around the world protest against Israel, the intifada, but no, what they're actually talking about is a global terrorism campaign. The vast majority of them. Because I mean that's what the Intifada was. It was a violent campaign. You say globalize it. I have seen some that say, "Oh, we're talking metaphorically or whatever," but then those same groups, on other occasions, will support acts of violence and property destruction, and things like that. Intifada has also basically become a synonym for uprising and revolution. So you will have groups that are just marginally involved in Middle Eastern issues now using the term intifada, and they're just radical, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, whatever, anti-police, to fund the police type groups, and oh yeah, it's our intifada. So it's kind of also taken on to become a popular slogan, that's just adopted by all the people that want to use the buzzword.
Got it. Thank you for that. And it does make sense. The Islamists in various countries have done a great job of appropriating sort of left-wing talking points. And I think this is one example of sort of inserting their talking point being appropriated by the rest of the left wing quite ably, as their rallying call. It's interesting. I know Larry Hochberg had a question. Larry, do you want to jump in?
The mostly what you're describing is probably what individuals can do. We at ELNET, of course, are an organization. How do you interact currently with the Clarion Intelligence Network? And do you interact? And do you have similar agendas or complementary? Or how do you fit together in this exposure? Because a lot of their exposure is individuals as opposed to organizations, I think.
Right. So I was working at Clarion Project and conceived of it and created the Clarion Intelligence Network and led it until I had a bunch of different independent things going on, and so I just decided to kind of go my own way and then hook up with Capital Research Center and focus more on the organizational level as opposed to the individual level, because I've been doing that for just for so long. So Clarion Intelligence Network, like you said, focuses on individuals. I have my own stuff that I've been doing since before I was a part of Clarion in terms of going after individuals. So there just hasn't really been a need for me to combine that with my former employer, just because it's all going to the same place, and there's so many targets to track and follow that it's if they happen to find a guy that is building a bomb and I find a guy that's building a bomb and they end up being the same person, I mean, so what? And from the perspective of law enforcement, double reporting in that case can sometimes be a good thing, because then that means you have multiple credible sources all saying, hey, our radar is saying that this human projectile is a problem. So it's just a matter of, yeah.
Okay, a lot of our people on the call are European, and so you want to enlist them into knowing more about this problem and what they can do in their themselves, but through their organizational work through ELNET in Europe to make it more known how much of this there is and how incestuous it is. So I think that's the key. It's easy to talk about it, but action is really what counts, I think. So
yeah. in terms of specific action, it's hard for me to say because I don't know what each organization does and what the capability is. But in terms of messaging, which is something I've studied very intensely for a long time, I am seeing it's increasingly true that part of the problem is ecosystems, and penetrating those ecosystems, and not just pro-terrorism. It's you know how I said before how a lot of this starts with the idea that I can't make it after college, because society has changed, modernization has happened so fast. Sometimes is the rhetoric. Others say it's just inherently flawed and horrible and racist to begin with, but others say things have changed so rapidly that I can't make it. And so that's the broader ecosystem. So you do have the pro-terrorism ecosystem that's really hard to penetrate. But the outer layer there, that might, I would say that's got to be penetrated by voices using that type of language, because their vetting process for sources is, does someone understand that? The predicament I feel like I'm in. And then when they see the Marxist, the anarchists, and the Islamists understanding that, they say, okay, so they're right about that. What else are they right about? And so if you have pro-Israel groups that tend to be more conservative, Republican, libertarian, and some of them are saying, hey, look, it's actually, their message is, hey, it's not as bad as you're saying. You can make it. You're probably going to make it. I don't think that resonates. And I'm not saying that whether they're right or wrong. I'm not making a judgment call on that. I don't know. But I can tell you that overall ecosystem, it cannot be penetrated by a voice that does not start with, we understand that the odds are against you in society.
Try to make what we would call trade out of them, I guess.
I'm sorry?
To try and make them disreputable. That's what you're saying, right?
For some of them, yeah. The problem is that a lot of this starts with groups that are not considered disreputable. So like to us, if you're out there bashing capitalism and saying, you know, the future is bleak and you can't make it, that might be disreputable to some people in our world, but to theirs it's not. And so they get introduced into this ecosystem not by so much by, oh, that group's saying something pro Hamas, I agree with it. Like I said, it starts with this kind of populist. The system is so screwed up, I can't possibly get ahead. There's no social mobility, and there's actually a term called anti-work that I've heard. So they get in that ecosystem, and then from there things get more and more extreme, and they get exposed to these other sources of information that are pro-Hamas.
Okay.
Yeah, this is recruitment. I would say this is recruitment on a mass scale. And this is exactly what foreign adversaries, when trying to find a vulnerable US citizen or UK citizen or anybody in the West to turn, you find someone who's vulnerable and you find what their vulnerabilities are. So Ryan, what you're suggesting is these groups are adept at tapping the vulnerabilities of young people today. And one of those vulnerabilities is the insecurity of their own future. So that's something that every country, every Western country needs to understand. So with that, I know we're running behind. Ryan, I want to ask, because we've had a couple of people ask, where can people find your report, Marching Towards Violence?
Sure. Aside from, if you contact me, I can send it to you directly if you have trouble finding it. But at capitalresearch.org is the website for Capital Research Center.
And it has the report on there?
It has a report on there, yep.
Okay. And if anybody would like to contact us, you can contact, is that okay, Ryan, for your email if that's what they're looking for?
Absolutely.
How would you like? Okay. Well, with that, everybody, went a little over time. Thank you very much. I hope you found this enlightening and worthwhile. Continue to keep ELNET in your focus. We're doing great work. I want to thank Ryan for spending the time with us today. An important subject, and we all have a real battle on our hands to protect the future. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good day.
Thank you.